G'day kids, my name's Spencer Shaw from Brush Turkey Enterprises, and I'm here to talk to you about the rainforests of southeast Queensland, and in particular the Mary Cairncross Scenic Reserve here on the Blackall Range near Maleny. But first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the country on which we stand. The traditional owners of this land are the Jinnabara people, and people have lived in this country for tens of thousands of years. I think that's the really important thing for us to remember, that this isn't wilderness, this is a home to people and has been so for tens of thousands of years. I've been very fortunate to live in this area for the last 30 odd years now, and to be working with this rainforest for well over 20 years. It's an amazing rainforest. I'll say this again many times, this is our own Amazon, this is our own Borneo. This is a fantastic patch of rainforest for you kids to come and learn about the amazing biodiversity in southeast Queensland, and in particular in this area. Okay, welcome kids to Mary Cairncross. This is part of the walk that you can come on, and we're going to take you for a little virtual tour of today. This full loop with all the different types of forests that you're going to get to see. Without further ado, let's go for a walk. What an amazing forest we find ourselves in today at Mary Cairncross. Over 60 million years in the making, a landscape that goes back all the way through time. The soil that we're on has only been here a mere 25 million years, from some volcanic lava flows that happened here that formed the Glasshouse Mountains, and also formed this beautiful deep red soil that we find our rainforests on now. The flora that's here, the trees, the vines, the ferns, are things that have been evolving here for tens and tens of millions of years. It's a really amazingly diverse place. As I said, this is our own Amazon, and it's right on your doorstep, kids. This amazing spot that we find ourselves in today. There's an amazing diversity of plants in Mary Cairncross. We've got 300 species of local native plants. And what I mean by local native plants is plants that grow here naturally and have been part of this region for thousands, if not millions of years. So Mary Cairncross, 300 species. The Sunshine Coast region that we all live in, 1,500 species. We're part of a global world biodiversity hotspot. There's 3 in Australia. We've got the wet tropics in North Queensland, the amazing rainforests up there. We've got one in southwest Australia, the amazing heath and woodlands of Western Australia, and we've got one right here where we live in southeast Queensland, and northern New South Wales encompasses these rainforests that have been part of this landscape for eons. So this area, this biodiversity hotspot that we live in, is part of what they call the McPherson-Macleay overlap, and all that means is it's part of that the Gondwanan supercontinent that used to be, you might have heard about if you're into your dinosaurs. The Gondwana encompass South America, Australia, Antarctica, and South Africa and India. And these amazing forests have developed in those areas. And we've also, as Australia split and moved north, we've got the interactions with Asia as well, and a whole overlay of plants that brings in this complex diversity of plants that we find in this area. So when we're in the rainforest, we can feel like it goes on forever. But this is only 55 hectares of rainforest that's left on this southern part of the Blackall Range, where you find yourself in Maleny or Montville or any of those little towns around there. Only 55 hectares. Feels big because of the height of the trees, but it's tiny. It's surrounded by paddocks, and so much of this, what was rainforest on the Blackall Range, was cleared between 100 and 150 years ago, and this is just less than 1% of the rainforest that would have been here previous to that is now left, and this is Mary Cairncross represents that little bit of forest. High diversity, but now isolated and under threat. Although these trees live for long times, they might not have a pollinator that works with them anymore, or an animal that carries their fruit might be gone, and so we might be seeing trees that might disappear over the next few hundred years, which would be a real shame. So what we're doing is doing so much work to help reconnect these patches of forest with other little patches of forest through the landscape. And that's something you guys can all help with in tree plants, and by learning about and realising just how amazingly important these tiny little patches of rainforest are, and helping them reconnect and spread out across the landscape again. Although I'm here to talk to you mainly about plants, there's more than plants in a rainforest or any kind of forest. There's so much stuff going on with fungi, plants and animals, and that's what I want to focus on in this little story here. You might notice that in Mary Cairncross we've got quite a bare understory. There's not much in the way of small plants, and there's not much in the way of leaf litter, because as soon as the leaves fall from the forest trees and hit the ground, they're either eaten by giant worms, or the fungus, the mushrooms, get down and break those leaves down and those branches down and the fallen trees down and turn them back into trees again. So the fungi, what we call the mycorrhiza, and mycorrhiza just means root fungi, they connect the trees under the ground. There's all these mycorrhiza connecting all the tree roots, moving through this ground here, connecting all these trees together into one big community, and linking the whole thing together and cycling all those nutrients. That's what's happening down here. As we move up, we see more interactions with animals. So the trees can't do much without the insects that pollinate their flowers, the animals that pollinate their flowers. For instance, flying foxes that you might be aware of eating fruit in your backyard are also really important pollinators of our eucalypt forests in particular, and so in our rainforest as well. Most of these trees are often set up to flower at their peak at night time, so it's either moths or flying foxes that are doing all their pollinating. And then once you've got a flower that's pollinated, you produce a fruit, and that fruit's got to move through the landscape as well. And the way that you move that fruit through the landscape is by a tricky bit of marketing. You wrap the seed in some colourful flesh, and there you have an animal come along and think, I'm going to eat some of that, and the animal eats it and moves away and discreetly disperses it somewhere else. And then that seed comes up and we have the forest starting all over again. And that's what's really important, is all the relationships that are happening with the plants, animals and fungi. That's what makes a forest. Not all those little individuals on their own, but the whole community working together and making this beautiful whole that we have here today. For me, a rainforest is about many layers of all the different areas of the rainforest that are filled with different species. We start at the top with the emergence. They're the big trees that go up 50, maybe 60 metres in some cases. In Mary Cairncross, probably about the 40 to 50 metre mark, and they stick up above the canopy trees. They're things like figs. We've got two different figs in here, the small leaf fig and Watkins fig, and they rise up above the rest of the canopy. Then we have the canopy. The canopy is still very high trees that are probably anywhere between that 30 and 40 metre mark, so still very high trees for you guys. There's not many people who are going to be climbing these trees, and they're a long way up, but so those trees are rising, and a very gentle canopy that's running through the rest of the forest, and that's what blocks out the light and what makes it so dark in here. And then below that we have a mid-story, and that's some slightly smaller trees until we eventually make our way down here where we've got very little in the understory. So everybody's aiming at that light, everybody's up there in the sun trying to make the most of the sunshine to make their food through photosynthesis. But in between we've got all sorts of different plants. We've got plants stacked on trees, the vines that are climbing up. We have ferns up in the canopy. And I'd mentioned those figs before. The figs do that amazing thing that although they're the massive tree that's poking out through the top that we call the emergent, when they start as a very tiny seed dropped by a bird in the canopy and then working its way down other trees, and that's why they call them strangler figs, because that fig works its way down through the canopy, down other trees, and then eventually strangles that tree and becomes the big dominant emergent tree that it is. So that's, the rainforest is made of many different layers, and that's just some of them covered here. Okay, another name for the rainforests in southeast Queensland is vine forest. And this is a great example of one of the giant vines that helps hold this forest together. I was talking about how all the forest is linked. This is another piece that physically does it, is these giant vines that hold all the canopy trees together. So when you get a big cyclone in, it helps lock it all together, and it helps withstand cyclones and strong winds a bit better. Unfortunately, when a big tree does fall down, the vines can help pull a whole heap of other trees down with it. But these vines certainly do weave through the forest and hold the whole thing together. This giant tree behind me is our black bean, or Moreton Bay chestnut. This is a member of the legume family, and legumes are peas. So we've got this giant pea here. Look what happens when I open that pot up. There's beautiful big seeds in there. Now these can have anywhere between 2 and 5 or 6 seeds, so a lot of seed. And just like the beans that you get out of the backyard, these could potentially be eaten, but they require a lot of work to make them edible, and quite a few days. Now when I was much younger, I almost made my friends very sick by reading that this was Moreton Bay chestnut and assumed it was like the chestnuts that I'd grown up with in England, and that we just boil them up and we could eat them. But luckily somebody stopped us just in time, and we realised that they can be poisonous unless they're treated in the right way. So I was acting out of a lack of knowledge, but Indigenous people have lived in this country for thousands and thousands of years and had all these things worked out. And all you need to do is leach them in a lot of water, mash them, leach them in more water. It takes a few days to process it, but then you've got a whole heap of starch you can make very tasty little cakes out of. Those sort of things are being done again in Australia after all too long a break, but Indigenous people are reconnecting with this amazing food source, and maybe you'll get to share some of this in the future sometime too. Here's another vine that you'll see along the tracks of Mary Cairncross. This is called candle vine. And the reason it's called a candle vine, it's a good common name, because when we hold the leaf up on our hand like this, we can see the candle and the flame. So it's a really easy one to remember, and that's something you're going to see in Mary Cairncross. Growing up the trees, or growing up quite narrow trees like this, but certainly growing up bigger trees, has a little red berry for the birds, starts off life down at the base of the tree and then climbs up it. Candle vine. This vine that's got me here is why you don't want to leave the track and walk through the forest of Mary Cairncross. This is called lawyer cane, or wait a while, because if you get stuck in it, you'll be waiting a while. The spines all along. That's hooked onto my shirt there. It would easily hook onto my skin if I dragged myself along there. And that's what these tendrils are running all through the forest. This vine's running through. It's got prickly stems. It's a very prickly vine. It uses those prickles to climb, but it also stops us from walking into the forest where we shouldn't be. On the plus side, it provides good habitat to things like scrub wrens, because it's a great place for them to build their nests further up the vines, where you can imagine if it's uncomfortable for us, it's also going to be uncomfortable for snakes who would eat the babies, the chicks of those birds as well. So it might seem a bit prickly and unnecessary, but it's a very necessary thing. Prickles are really good in the forest to help protect animals as well. Now, believe it or not, this vine is a palm. We have 3 palms in Mary Cairncross. We have this wait-a-while vine, we have walking stick palms, and we have pick-a-bean palms. All very useful plants. Walking sticks, after World War I, were harvested for making walking sticks for the returned soldiers. And pick-a-bean, the name picker comes from the container in the First Nation languages of this area. And so the leaf bases can be turned into these fantastic containers. So that's our pick-a-bean palm up above us there as well. 3 palms in Mary Cairncross: pick-a-bean, walking stick palm, lawyer cane. One of the key features of our rainforests are these things. We call them buttresses. They're thin planks, bases of wood. They're all sort of attached to the roots, but you will find that the roots in these rainforest trees, in spite of the size of the trees, are quite shallow. So there's all this bracing happening at the base here to help spread out the weight of the tree in this little bit of ground that they're anchored into. You remember I was talking about the vines before holding the whole thing together at the top? The buttresses are part of what holds it together at the base. Now, this is one of the iconic species of Mary Cairncross and a fair bit of the east coast of Australia. This is our red cedar. This was the first gold rush in Australia, was for red cedar, the red cedar gold rush, where Europeans came into these river systems, marked trees, cut trees down, sent heaps of trees down the river. Unfortunately, a lot got wasted. It was just too big to process. But here we have these amazing red cedars. These ones that are left in the forest were probably too crooked to be milled or chopped down. And actually this one's probably quite a young one. And even though it's such a massive tree now, it starts off with from these tiny fruit, and that's not the size of the seed. There would be maybe 30 seed in each one of these small fruit here. So very tiny seeds. A few months ago, the forest floor was covered with red cedar seedlings, but it's too shady for them to grow now. They need a lot of disturbance. So most of those cedar seedlings have died or been eaten by lots of animals, and they never really got away. But when they get a break in the sunlight, they grow very fast, and we end up with these giant red cedar trees that will last hundreds and hundreds of years. You might be able to identify these red cedars, not just by those big buttresses that we've just been discussing, but by this, what we call a tessellated bark. You see all these square chunks of bark peeling off the tree. And that's one way to identify this tree. Look at those fantastic little peelings of bark. Imagine what a great homes they're making for all the little, what we call invertebrates, the little insects hiding under there as well. We're very lucky in a place like Mary Cairncross that you're not just walking into a forest and having to work out what the names of trees are all by yourself or by referring to a book. We've got these great signs in here, and the challenge I want to give you guys is to come to Mary Cairncross and learn at least 5 of these plants from these signs. This one's the black apple. It's got these beautiful suckers all at the base and a nice big trunk running all the way up there into the mid-story. But all the way down this track, we've got lots of these signs. You're going to be able to see dozens and dozens of signs. Learn at least 5 while you're in here. Make some notes, learn that species name, learn the common name, read up on the plant, make some notes of these amazing plants and learn something about our rainforest. Now, I've talked to you about the threats that this rainforest faces from the historical clearing of the rainforests of the Blackall Range, and that this is just 1% that is left. Another threat besides all that clearance and the fragmentation and just how small this patch of forest is disease. Now, we have a disease called myrtle rust which arrived in southeast Queensland in 2011 and has wreaked particular havoc on our rainforest myrtles. Myrtles are those things you might be aware of, things like the eucalypts, gum trees, melaleucas, paperbarks. Those trees haven't been affected too bad, but a lot of our rare rainforest myrtles have been. This poor guy here is called a thready bark myrtle. It's lost its top. It's got little bits of growth on it, but they're particularly badly affected. It's a disease that rots or eats up the leaves of these trees. There's another plant called the Blackall Range myrtle that used to be in the eastern side of Mary Cairncross and now has actually become extinct in this reserve. So there's many threats that these rainforests are facing, and disease is certainly one of them. So I hope you've enjoyed our little tour of Mary Cairncross today. I hope I've given you some things to do. I want you to go for a walk in the rainforest, look at those signs, identify a few trees, learn some of those trees by name so they become like your friends. I want you to go home, go to school and look at this landscape through Google Earth and see how tiny these little patches of forest are in the wider landscape. These rainforests have survived for hundreds of millions of years. We need to be the stewards, the custodians, to see them lasting another few thousand years at the very least. You kids can be all part of that. I want you to be as passionate about these rainforests as I am. be an ambassador for these beautiful rainforests, help preserve them, find a way to live and work with them like I have, and enjoy them as well, the fantastic landscape they provide us to live in. Thank you.